This is Forma, a planet not so different from ours. Covered mostly in ocean with continents large and far apart, one of its major continents is Centaura. Centaura is home to many nations, each with its own government, army, history, and most importantly, good old rivalries. But we'll forget that last part for now. The year is 1905, and Centaura is at peace. Down south lives Antares. At first glance, Antares is just another nation on the map. It has borders, cities, armies, and a government like everyone else. But Antares is a little different. It began in Scorpius, where the tall monarchy united the kingdoms of Lupus, Norma, and Ara into one Antarian state. So to put it simply, the Antarian Empire was born by dissolving borders. So expansion was tied into its culture and even its religion, where the average Antarian saw war as a service to the gods, which meant living next to Antares was a wee bit uncomfortable, because if your neighboring country believes war is holy, then you might want to start protecting your borders. But in 1905, Antares was still mostly a southern power. It had fought before, especially against its northern neighbor Aquila, and lost. So for now, Antares had to keep his ambitions close to home. But Antares would not stay quiet forever. In the west of Centaura, Corvus was trying to survive a problem of its own. That problem was Cetus. Cetus was a naval empire with a strong fleet, growing ambitions, and a very clear interest in one resource that South Corvus just happens to have a ton of: coal. Now, coal is a major industry of Corvus, so when one day Cetus just decides to swoop in and take all of it, the Corvans were less than welcome. Eventually, in 1908, Corvus could take no more and declared war on Cetus. They started off strong, regaining control over South Corvus and pushing further into Cetan territory, but as the war dragged on, both sides fell into a stalemate. By 1911, Corvus had secured South Corvus, but since Corvus was doing worse than Cetus economically, if fighting were to continue, Corvus would probably break first if the war were to drag on for too long. If only there was a nation that happened to be next to Cetus, had a very big army, and had a lot of ambition. Oh yeah. In 1911, Corvus asked Antares to join the war, and Antares agreed, but it was not doing this out of kindness. Oh no. Since Corvus would get Antarian help against Cetus, in return, Corvus would become tied to Antares as a vassal state. The Corvans, however, did not care. They just wanted this war over with. For the Antarians though, this was perfect. They got their new vassal, and more importantly, they finally got a reason to go to war. Antarian troops pushed through Cetus from the south, and the Corvans kept fighting from the north. This proved to be too much for the Cetan army, and within a year, the empire of Cetus had fallen. And because Corvus had agreed to the deal, it became Scorpii Corvus, a vassal state tied directly to the Antarian Empire. Antares, on the other hand, had just won its first major war outside the south, and you and I know that this is just the beginning. East of Cetus lives Aquila, the nation that had beaten Antares before. In fact, the Aquilan army had a reputation for being disciplined and very hard to push around, earning them the nickname the Iron Army. They knew that one day Antares would be back, so years before the war, they built the Ring of Fire, a line of defensive artillery installations along their borders designed to make any invasion as painful as possible. And at first, it worked. In 1912, Antares attacked Aquila, and failed, which must have been a pretty satisfying moment for the Aquilans, as Antares had just beaten Cetus, gained Corvus as a vassal, and stepped outside the south for the first time, only for the Aquilans to blast them right back. That was until the Antarians decided to use one of the most modern weapons of the time. You know him, you love him, tanks. This would prove to be enough to break the Aquilan defenses, as the Ring of Fire, built to stop armies, was not ready for modern armor. By 1913, the Antarians had successfully breached the Ring of Fire and continued their campaign. However, they now had to traverse the dense forests of Aquila, where the Aquilan soldiers could hide, ambush, retreat, and then disappear back into the trees. So if the trees were helping the Aquilans, then the trees had to go. In a move called the Scorch, the Antarian soldiers began setting fire to the forests. At first, this was meant to flush out Aquilan fighters hiding in the trees, but as fires usually do, they spread uncontrollably. Forests and farms burned, and by the time it was over, nearly 40% of the Aquilan country had been scorched. The Antarians began pushing through major cities and roads, and eventually Aquila fell. Antares had won again. After Aquila fell, the rest of Centaura started watching Antares a little more closely. Cetus had fallen, Corvus had become a vassal, and now Aquila had been conquered too, all in the span of 3 years. East of Aquila was Vega, and by this point it was pretty obvious where Antares might look next. Luckily for Vega, they had not been sitting around doing nothing. Years before the Antarians arrived, the Vegans had built the Miras Plata Wall, a long line of bunkers and heavy guns along their border with Aquila. And Vega was not the only one getting nervous. Further east was Grusa, and even there, people were preparing for the possibility of an Antarian invasion. Some Grusans crossed the border themselves and joined the Vegan army to fight Antares. So when Antares finally came for Vega, it was walking into a less than fortunate situation. A prepared enemy, a fortified border, and a wall built specifically to stop them. So when the Antarians launched attacks to breach through the wall in 1914, it was abruptly stopped. But if Antares had learned something from its earlier wars, it's that if one path didn't work, it could always find another. Since even tanks weren't gonna push through this wall, they would decide to just go around it instead. So in 1915, the Antarian forces launched a naval invasion in southeastern Vega, landing far from the defenses Vega had spent years preparing. The Antarians had completely bypassed the Miras Plata Wall and were now walking on Vegan soil. From there, Antarian forces pushed inland, captured Santa Maria, and forced the Vegan army to retreat east into Grusa. But chasing them further east was not as simple as moving the front line. Grusa was a desert nation, meaning that pushing further into Grusa would be much more costly due to soldiers needing water, vehicles needing fuel, and roads being more important. If the land was going to slow them down, then the sea would have to do the work. Since Grusa was a desert nation, they obviously relied a lot on their ports for supplies, so the Antarian navy began blockading Grusa, cutting off supplies. The Grusans fought back, but their navy was no match for the Antarians, and slowly, with pressure from both land and sea, the Grusans were slowly pushed back into the city of Leopolis, where they eventually surrendered. And in 1919, Grusa is reorganized into Scorpii Grusii. One by one, the countries in the south had either fallen to Antares or been pulled into its empire. So at this point, every northern nation knew they had to do something about this giant. So the nations of Riaa, Tucana, Centauri, and Columba formed the Northern Centauran Alliance, or the NCA, to stop Antares from invading the north, and they would be the first to strike back. In 1924, under Operation Hammer of Peace, the NCA launched multiple counteroffensives towards Scorpii Corvus, Scorpii Grusii, and occupied Aquila. The plan was to push Antares back and spark resistance inside the territories Antares had already taken. But this plan failed, and the NCA was pushed back almost exactly where it started. The Antarians obviously wanted to continue their offensive north, but they had one very large problem: Columba. Columba sat between Antares and the north, and it was protected by the Mesa Range, a massive mountain range that made any invasion extremely difficult. So even though Antares had beaten the southern nations, moving north was not going to be simple. It wasn't going to be as easy as charging open plains, and there was no clear coastline to land behind either. So for a while, the war was stuck in a stalemate. Over the years, Columban territory would suffer continuous aerial bombings from Antares, but Antares could still not push through. It went on for so long that in 1927, Emperor Kalvin Tau, the man who started Antares' push against Centaura, died while the war was still dragging on. It was replaced by his son, Aaron Tau, and Aaron was much less patient than his father. He wanted this war won, and fast. So under the new emperor, Antares prepared one of its biggest offensives yet, Operation Cataclysm. In 1929, Antares attacked Columba from both the west and the east. They also used paratroopers to push through the mountains, turning the Mesa Range from Columba's greatest shield into a battlefield from every direction. In 1931, Antarian forces captured Welsey, cutting off eastern Columba from the rest of the NCA, and not long after, the capital city of Mandari fell. With the capital gone, Columba could no longer hold together the way it had before. Fighting did continue along the Riaan border and in the Mesa Range, but the country itself had been broken. From this point on, it would be known as Columba. And just like that, the nation, once thought to be naturally impenetrable, had just fallen. Now the road north was open, and the northern nations had to face the reality that Antares was now at their doorstep. But the NCA was not done yet. In 1934, they launched the Hour of Reclamation, a major counteroffensive across the Columban front, and for once, they actually succeeded as they pushed Antares back and even secured parts of Mandari. With the north gaining ground, it was finally time for Antares to make new allies, and it found one in Ursa. Soon after, Antares, Columba, Ursa, Scorpii Corvus, and Scorpii Grusii formed the Solstice Alliance, and this would be enough to turn the NCA's counterattack into a disaster. Because while the NCA was pushing into Columba, Ursa opened a new front. In what became known as the Day of the Storm, Ursan troops landed across Tucana, supported by joint air and naval attacks. This was a major problem as most of Tucana's army was still fighting in Columba, meaning the forces left behind at home were not ready to stop a full invasion. Riaa did send units to help, but it did very little. And if you thought the Columban front was any better for the NCA, in 1937, Antares launched Operation Labris, a counteroffensive against the NCA while they were distracted by the Ursan invasion of Tucana. Antarian forces pushed forward again, capturing Cyrillus, Monapa, and Normonte. And eventually, in 1939, Tucana surrendered to Ursa. And 1 year later, after Antarian forces captured Hadina, Riaa surrendered to Antares. Only one nation left. By this point, Centauri was completely alone, and in 1942, Antares began its invasion, massing infantry and armored forces along the border. Centauri had spent years preparing its defenses. After seeing their neighboring nations fall, the defenses only grew stronger and stronger, but Antares brought specialized bunker buster tanks designed to break through them. Eventually, Antares broke through and the fighting escalated into Centauri cities. Citizens of Centauri faced months and months of aerial bombardment until eventually in 1944, Centauri surrendered. And just like that, the Centauran War was officially over. Antares had successfully unified the continent. Riaa and Centauri became Scorpii Riaa, Columba became Scorpii Columba, and Tucana was handed over to Ursa. For the rest of Forma, this war was a warning, because an empire built by conquest can only stay still for so long. Soon, one question would be asked: would Antares stop at Centaura? And the answer would come later in the war that would end it all. Anyways, thank you all for watching this video. This video took quite a while to make, so if you'd like to see part 2 regarding that ahead, feel free to click subscribe and press the like button. See ya.